Back in 2022, everyone got the same promise. Inflation is temporary. It'll cool off and prices will come back down. People believe that about groceries specifically, pay a little more for a while, then things go back to normal. That's not what happened. 3 years later, look at what temporary actually turned into. The Federal Reserve itself has cut interest rates multiple times since then, specifically because headline inflation cooled enough to justify it. Gas prices have come down. Used car prices have come down. Airfares in a lot of markets have come down. Grocery prices as a category mostly haven't. That's the part that doesn't fit the story people were told. Walk through a grocery store today and check the categories that spiked hardest back then. Coffee, beef, chocolate, orange juice, eggs. Most of them didn't come back down. They just stopped climbing as fast. A pound of ground coffee cost about $6 in 2024. Today, it's over $9. Ground beef is up over 30% in the same stretch. Orange juice up 15%, on top of already record high prices from years before that. One recent analysis ran the numbers on a simple taco night, basic ingredients for a family of four. 6 years ago, about $17.50. Today, nearly $25. Same meal, same ingredients, 40% more expensive. So here's the actual question worth asking. If inflation itself has cooled off, why haven't the prices? Start with the most counterintuitive example of all. Chocolate. Cocoa futures hit a record high of over $11,000 a ton in mid-2024. By this year, those same futures had fallen back to around $3,000 to $4,000, a drop of roughly 65%. You'd expect chocolate bars to be getting cheaper right now. They're not. Retail chocolate prices kept climbing even as the raw ingredient collapsed in price. Here's why. And it's a genuinely different mechanism than simple corporate greed. Chocolate makers don't buy cocoa the day they need it. They lock in contracts months, sometimes years, in advance to protect themselves from exactly this kind of volatility, which means companies today are still selling chocolate made from cocoa they bought at last year's record high prices. The cheap cocoa sitting in the futures market right now won't show up on store shelves for a while, not until sometime next year, once those older contracts finally run out. It's not that companies are refusing to lower prices out of stubbornness. It's that the expensive ingredient is still working its way through the pipeline. Some chocolate makers have hedged smartly enough to blunt the damage. One major Swiss chocolatier reportedly locked in favorable cocoa contracts for 2027. A move analysts estimate could save the company close to 500 million Swiss francs. That's the exception, not the rule. Most manufacturers weren't positioned that well, and they're the ones whose prices you're actually paying at the register right now. There's a demand side to this too, and it's not good news for the industry either. Global chocolate consumption has actually fallen by more than 4% in one recent quarter, as shoppers respond to higher prices by simply buying less, which means companies are stuck in an uncomfortable spot. Raise prices to cover expensive cocoa and volume drops. Don't raise prices and margins collapse instead. Most chose the first option and passed the squeeze straight to you. There's a second layer to the chocolate story too, and it's a little unsettling. One supply chain consultant who's worked in the Ivory Coast for over 20 years put it plainly. The price discussed in headlines is the futures price, a projection tied to contracts for cocoa that hasn't even been delivered yet. Companies are still working through raw materials they bought months ago at $7,000 to $8,000 a ton. That cost gets passed to you now, regardless of what the futures market says today. By his estimate, retail prices might not actually fall until the very end of this year, not until fresh harvests from Ivory Coast and Ghana finally work their way through the pipeline. Coffee and cocoa share a deeper root cause, too: climate. Cocoa farms across West Africa, which grow about 70% of the world's supply, have been hit by drought and disease for consecutive growing seasons. Coffee growing regions in Brazil and Vietnam have been hit by heat waves and unusual frosts. Orange juice tells an even starker climate story. Florida's citrus industry has been devastated by a disease called citrus greening, combined with repeated hard freezes. U.S. orange supply has collapsed as a direct result. Florida orange production has fallen so far that some seasons now produce a small fraction of what the state grew 20 years ago. There's no quick fix for a disease that's already inside the trees. Replanting takes years before a new tree produces meaningful fruit, and citrus greening can spread to the replacements too. So orange juice isn't waiting on a good harvest to get cheaper. It's waiting on an entire industry to partially rebuild itself tree by tree over the better part of a decade. None of these are pandemic supply chain issues anymore. They're agricultural realities that don't reverse just because headline inflation numbers improve. There's a broader pattern hiding underneath all of this too. Grocery retailers themselves have consolidated sharply over the past decade, giving a smaller number of chains more pricing power than they used to have. Some retailers have also adopted dynamic, algorithm-driven pricing, adjusting shelf prices in near real time based on demand, weather, or even the time of day. That kind of pricing is very good at pushing prices up quickly when costs rise. It's far less enthusiastic about pushing them back down just as quickly. Olive oil went through its own version of this crisis, and it got genuinely strange. Prices surged more than 100% at their peak, driven by drought across Spain, Italy, and Greece, the three countries that produce most of the world's supply. Spain's harvest alone fell by more than half in one particularly bad season. Prices got so extreme that grocery stores in parts of Europe started experiencing olive oil theft, shoplifters specifically targeting bottles of it off the shelf. Prices have since eased somewhat, but a fresh heat wave across Europe this summer has already cut French milk production by 15 to 20%, and olive groves in Greece and Portugal have burned in wildfires. Producers are warning prices could climb again by autumn. Butter and cheese, which draw on some of the same dairy supply chains, are exposed to that same heat. Labor costs tell a separate, equally sticky story. Transportation costs are up. Wages across the food supply chain are up. Insurance costs for farms, trucking companies, and food manufacturers have all climbed sharply. Packaging costs are up too. None of these costs are going back down on their own, because none of the underlying pressures driving them are reversing either. Not the wages, not the insurance premiums. Now here's the part that's less about farms and factories and more about human psychology. Raising prices is easy. Lowering them is hard. Once a company raises a price and customers keep buying anyway, that new price becomes the baseline. There's very little competitive pressure to lower it again, especially once every competitor in the category raised prices at roughly the same time for roughly the same reasons. Executives have a blunt way of describing this internally. Once shoppers adjust to a higher price point, that adjustment becomes permanent unless a competitor forces the issue. Some companies, faced with expensive ingredients, chose a quieter tactic instead of a visible price hike, shrinking the package instead. Same price, less product inside, a cereal box that's an inch shorter, a bag of chips that's noticeably lighter in a package that looks almost identical. Consumers often don't notice a smaller box the way they notice a bigger number at checkout. which means the effective price increase happens anyway, just hidden inside the packaging. One market analyst summed up the whole dynamic in a single line. Genuinely stressed out consumers are now doing constant mental math. What they must buy to survive the week versus what they'd actually like to buy. That gap between necessity and preference has never been wider. So will food ever actually get cheap again? Some individual items probably will. Eggs already have, falling sharply after the bird flu outbreaks that drove their prices up, eased, and flocks rebuilt. Cocoa prices may eventually filter down to retail shelves too, once those older, expensive contracts finally expire. But the broader grocery bill as a whole, going back to 2020 levels, is extremely unlikely. Climate disruption to key crops isn't reversing. Labor and insurance costs aren't reversing. Once shoppers adjust to a price, that's the new normal. Companies learn nothing forces them to reverse it. There's no natural mechanism left to push the number back down. There's one more historical parallel worth sitting with. This isn't the first time a temporary food price shock quietly became the new normal. After the oil shocks of the 1970s, plenty of economists confidently predicted food prices would ease once energy costs stabilized. Some categories did, plenty of others simply reset to a new, permanently higher baseline and stayed there for the rest of that decade and beyond. The honest answer is the one nobody wanted back in 2022. Some of this was never temporary. It was just slow to arrive, and now it's just as slow to leave if it ever fully does.